I'm Russell Edwards. I'm here today at the site of Leavesden Asylum with Martin, and today we're going to have a tour round what's left of old Leavesden Asylum. So Martin, can you tell us where we are precisely, please?
Where we are right now, Russell, is we're in front of what was the old administration building for the Leavesden Asylum. It was originally called Leavesden Asylum for Idiots and Imbeciles. It was built based on the Metropolitan Asylum Board, which was formed in 1868, and it was really at that time created for the care and taking off the streets of the people that were homeless and had learning disabilities or mental health issues in London, the north part of London. Leavesden Hospital was one of 6 facilities that were built by the Metropolitan Asylum Board, and people used to say, oh, calling it an asylum, lunatic asylum, that's horrible. But back in the days in 1868, Metropolitan Asylum Board was actually living by their name, because the true definition of asylum is a safe place of refuge. And that's what they were building for these people in the streets of London. They were actually building a safe place of refuge for them. So where we are is at Leavesden Asylum, as it was originally called, Leavesden Asylum for Idiots and Imbeciles. It was completed in 1870. What we see behind us now is the administration building, so that would have been 3 floors there. First floor would have been just storage and everything, because they didn't have underground basements to store food and dry goods, so they would have stored them there. The first floor would have been your administration wing, so the head surgeon would have been there, the head clerks, all the head nurses. If you were single and you worked on site here, you had a flat up above on the 3rd floor, so that's where you had all the matrons and any single individuals that were working here, upper management. When it opened in October 1st of 1870, this facility held 1,968 patients. It had a staff of about 240, so there was a little over 2,300 people living in this area. The whole site covered 84 acres. It was north of Watford, about 3 miles. It was built on what at that time was Asylum Road, because it was the only road that came from Watford all the way up to the asylum. So they called it Asylum Road right up until 1947, 1949, and then it's reintroduced as College Road, because at that time there were 3 nursing colleges and 2 industrial colleges here. So they thought, well, rather than Asylum Road, we're going to call it College Road. And so when the NHS was formed in 1949 and took over the facility, then they decided to call it College Road. So that's how that all got started. We also have here some of the other buildings that are on site. The old recreation hall, which is right next to the administration wing. That was built in 1891 for the purpose of providing recreation as a therapy method for the patients that were committed here. So they started doing recreation. They actually allocated £50 a year for the purchase of cards and board games. So they had something to do. It was actually considered quite the social event. They had staff bands, they had staff pantos, they had inmate bands that would play here, and it was considered quite the thing to come out to the recreation hall at the old Leavesden Hospital for an evening of entertainment or to see a panto or something. So yeah, it was quite the thing. We have some records of a steam train that used to run through here. So people would come by horse and cart, steam train, come up here, see a show. They were having cinemas here until 1912, when the projector burned down, caught fire, and they decided this wasn't a good idea. So some of the other local historic things that happened in this building: in 1950, they had the very first performance of the Abbots Langley, Gilbert and Sullivan Society. So they performed here at the Recreation Hall at Leavesden Hospital for many years, until they started performing at Henderson Hall in town. So there was quite a lot of things. They had services for the dead provided in the hall. They actually had patients that had services there, staff that had services there. They would have wedding receptions there. We have one old photograph from 1937. It was an absolute ornate, very detailed, very, very rich wood dance floor. I mean, it was quite the place, crystal chandeliers and everything. So even though it was a facility, medical facility, they still had, quite the showplace there in the recreation hall. So one of the other facilities that we have just behind us here is the old chapel. That was built originally 1868 to 1870. It's now owned by a company called Demand, which is design and manufacture for the disabled. So in theory, we still have a medical facility on this site 147 years after it was originally built in 1870. Wow. So it's quite historic. So
yeah, thank you very much. And so with Demand, the chapel,
yep,
the site that we're looking at, really of interest to me, because this is where the man proved to be the murderer known as Jack the Ripper was incarcerated in 1894.
Yep.
Is there much that you know about that story?
Well, I've known as much as not as obviously as much as the person who wrote the book, but no, we do know that Aaron Kosminski was the individual. He was known to the Metropolitan Police at the time of the murders. He was committed to Mile End facility by his brother Wolfgang at the time. He stayed there. He was then recommitted. He went to Colony Hatch. He was committed to Colony Hatch. 1894, so he was transferred to Leavesden in 1894. He stayed here. He worked actually earning up to 26 shillings a week as a patient here at the hospital. We do have records in the 1901 census of Aaron Kosminski being here at the hospital, and we do have a death certificate that says he died at the hospital March 25th, 1919. For a long time, we used to be able to speculate that he may actually be buried in the cemetery here. We have one of 3 cemeteries. We've just recently discovered that one of the cemeteries is actually used as a mass grave, which was another mystery of Leavesden Hospital that we've recently solved. So Aaron Kosminski was here. He did pass away in 1919. We know the area of the graveyard that he would have been in if he passed away in that time, but we also have a record where the body was actually transferred to his brother, and we believe he's now buried in West Ham Cemetery. But if you're a good conspiracy theorist, you'll notice that on the records there, you can't read the name on the tombstone in West Ham Cemetery, East Ham Cemetery. So you can't read the actual name on there, and they actually speculate that it's been spelt incorrectly. So the speculation is that it's actually his cousin that's buried here, and the real Aaron Kosminski, who is most likely Jack the Ripper, still may be buried in our cemetery. At least that's the story we like to tell everybody locally.
Wow. Yes, you're correct. He was taken by wolf. It was the cemetery was in East Ham Cemetery. That's absolutely correct.
Yep.
And of course, it was in 1919 when he passed away.
Yep.
Now, the fascinating story is that I've only just recently found out, actually speaking to you, Martin, that this is still here.
Yes.
So could you just kindly tell us? We've got a building to the far, just sort of tucked away, and for the camera's purposes, far left. That's really where the male, because could you tell us a little bit about where the males were brought and where the females were brought?
Well, it might be better if we just maybe take a short walk over there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we can just pick up over there, and you'll get an idea of where all the buildings were and where most likely Aaron Kosminski was actually housed as a patient here.
Thank you very much. So Martin, explain to me where we are now.
What we've done, Russell, is we've come from the front of the administration building. So we've left the front of Leavesden Asylum. We've come down which at the time was Asylum Road. It's now known as College Road, but it changed in 1949. So we've walked down there. We've entered in where everybody would have entered into the asylum back in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. We've come in through the service entrance where the gatehouse would have been. We've turned left. We've just recently passed where we're on the pathway where the original fire station would have been in 1963 when they had their own fire department. What we've done is we've come to a junction in the roadway because in 1932, when they took over the St. Pancras orphanage that was across the road and the 2 industrial schools that were there, they wanted to train up some of the patients that were here at the hospital. So they decided, right, we're going to take them across the road, but they didn't want to travel all the way across the road with 300-400 people twice daily and everything. So in 1949, just after 1949, about 1950, the NHS decided for safety reasons, we're going to build a subway. So what they've done is they actually dig a subway underneath College Road, which is still here today. So if you want to follow me, we'll go take a look at it.
Yeah. All right. So can I just clarify it? Has this just been basically filled in, or you could literally quite get under?
What we discovered, without the knowledge of my employer at the time, is we were curious because in 1949, when they did this, there was a story that they actually allowed some of the patients to paint murals along the side of the walls going into the subway going underneath the road. So we thought, well, that would be great if we could actually find that. So what an associate of mine did, we got some shovels one day, and we actually did some digging, and you can see the hole is still there. And what we've done is we actually have found some of the original paintings that are on the side of the walls. Unfortunately, they just filled the ends in, so what we believe is if we did dig down far enough, we could get in there to the point where we could clear it away a little bit, and with some lights and some photography equipment, we could record what are the paintings down there. We haven't been able to do that yet. A lot of paperwork involved in doing something that much of an excavation. An archaeological dig in this park takes a lot of time to convince people to allow you to do. But you can see the subways here. It would have handled 200 to 500 people every day coming back and forth right underneath College Road. It was here for right up until 1994, where they did just fill in the two ends and everything. It's the size of about 50 meters in length, and it's a ramp structure, goes all the way underneath the road. So that's how they got people back and forth. And if we want to go from here, I can show you where one of the original wards were.
Yes, please. I'd really appreciate it.
Let's go.
Thank you.
Where we are right now, Russell, would have been the very first building, very first ward that Leavesden Hospital would have had on this side of the park. There were two sides to the Leavesden Hospital. This would have been the men's wards over here, and then right across from us would have been the women's wards. They were three stories tall. Each floor had 60 patients, 180 patients per ward, per building, and there would have been 6 buildings for both of them, so 12 times 180, and that's how many people were housed here when they first opened. Now where we are, we're standing right approximately where the very first men's wards would have been, and this would have had the floors of kiwi, kestrel, and kingfisher. And we also believe that this is where the people that really needed to be secluded from the rest of society, from the rest of the hospital, would have been kept. We also believe that this would have been the location where Aaron Kosminski would have been kept while he was here at Leavesden Hospital. So all the buildings were connected by catwalks. It took over 35 minutes to feed everybody from the 3 different kitchens that they had in the hospital. So it was a very large location, very much a lot of people lived here. There was over 2,400 people living and working here at all times. So they had to take 42 acres of local farmland just to feed everybody. So that's what had been going on right here.
Wow, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. So we can see this is literally where Aaron Kosminski would have been housed when he was incarcerated in Leavesden Asylum, and obviously now no longer here, but this would have been the location. Thank you. Okay, so we've walked to the rear of Leavesden Asylum now, and Martin, explain to me where we are here.
This is one of the areas of the hospital that would have been the farthest north of everything, so this would have been out towards where they did all the gardening and everything. So the last building you have before you get into the 42 acres they harvested to feed everybody at the hospital would have been the Irish ward, which is also known as the isolation wing. Now back in those days, in the 1860s, 1870s, if you had any of the most known common contagious diseases, or you thought you had a contagious disease, plus you were committed to a mental facility, you would have ended up here. The nurses would have trained in the schools here on site for about 2 years. If you were assigned to the isolation wing, you would have lived in a nursing facility just behind us here on the other side of the wood line, and you would have worked here and you would have gone back and forth, never going back into general population, because if you're exposed to any kind of contagious diseases, they wouldn't let you back into general population. We do have one recorded record here of a nun who actually did that for about 37 years until she retired. So this is just the last building that you would see before you got into the very deep farming area of the hospital.
So isolation wing, so you're looking at things like smallpox.
Smallpox, anything that they didn't know about, rubella, anything they thought was contagious. We also, on site here, they also did have 2 tuberculosis wings, because back in those days, the treatment they thought for tuberculosis or any lung-borne diseases was to get them out, into the fresh air, get them out into the country, and 3 miles north of Watford was considered way out into the country back in those days, so that's where they'd bring them, to be treated for things like tuberculosis and that, so.
Okay. And the cholera outbreak.
We had an alleged cholera epidemic, which I investigated a couple of years ago, and did come to find out that they did request in 1898 a sum of money to research the water system that fed the hospital, because that's allegedly where the cholera epidemic came from.
Okay, so Martin, now we've walked quite a way out to the most northern part of Leavesden Asylum.
Yep.
So we're standing at this down the building now. Could you just kind of describe
where we are now, Russell, is we're at the very, very heart of the 42 acres they used to harvest to feed the 2,400 people that were here when it opened in the 1870s. What's behind us is the old farmer's cottage. Mr. Buchanan was the first farmer here, and he was paid 25 shillings a week plus the use of this two-bedroom house to harvest 42 acres to supply vegetables and fruit to the hospital. He also worked with about 64 patients, so they would help him harvest all this and everything. So this was his very first house, and then as we move on down the pathway, we'll start to get to different areas, the actual 42 acres, the 8 acres that they used to graze the cattle that fed milk to all the hospital, and the sewage treatment plant, and then on to the mysterious cemetery where we might have a mass burial.
Right, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Russell, where we are right now is we're on the very, very north side of the park. This is where they had the cemetery. Now, back in the days in 1870, when they opened the first cemetery, it would have been right across the road here, and it would have been right next to what you can see as the caretaker's lodge or the gravedigger's lodge. Now, they only had that grave site in 1870. They only had that for about 16 years, and then they mysteriously asked for another 1,192 square yards so they could have another cemetery. Well, we come to find out during our investigations and everything, there was a bit of a problem with the watering system. What they ended up doing was accidentally poisoning themselves with cholera. So they pumped poisoned water up to the hospital, causing a cholera epidemic, and they actually needed to find a new place to put a mass grave because they had so many people that had passed away from this. This was about 1898. So we have the records over in Hertfordshire Historical Society. We have the records there. In 1905, the Diocese of St. Albans authorized the move of the cemetery and consecrated the ground that's right behind us. So this lich gate right here, although it says 1886, was actually across the road at the very second cemetery.
Yeah.
So that was there in 1886. Then they moved it across the road in 1905 when they opened up this cemetery. So it's very interesting that they would have had to have only had a cemetery for about 6 years and then suddenly move across the street. So let's go take a look inside this cemetery here.
Sure. Okay, Martin, now coming to the conclusion of our visit, this is quite a significant place. Could you explain to me? I mean, it looks like it's overgrown, but this has a significant...
It is. That's a very significant place as far as the whole hospital goes, because it was the third cemetery that they did have here on site, and it was consecrated in 1905. And this is where, if you were a staff member in good standing here at the hospital, you had a free place for burial, you know, after you've done your 35 years and everything. And you were buried alongside the road. You can see the 3 stations or 4 stations of the cross, up here. So it's your typical cemetery setup. We have a memorial stone that was laid here when they opened the cemetery in 1905, and it says basically, remember to God all those who were buried here and whose names are recorded in the Book of Remembrance at Leavesden Hospital Chapel. Unfortunately, we've never been able to find that original Book of Remembrance. We're still looking for it. There's a lot of people who have relatives that are here, and we're working now on trying to get all the names collected and everything, so we have a record of it. It is overgrown. It isn't properly being taken care of. You know, we are trying to do some things with it, getting the local district council to take responsibility for this area and just not let it go to waste, because it is a very memorable place. We still have people that contact us from all over the world with relatives that may be here. They're doing a genealogy research, and they want to know if their great-grandmother is here or not. So we're trying to help with that, and so we're going to be working to put some names together and really, try and find out who's here and make a record of their last resting place. So it's going to be quite an adventure.
Okay.
This would have up in the cemetery for both staff and patients. The only thing is
yeah.
if you were staff and you had enough money, relatives had enough money to buy you a headstone or whatever, you'd be closer to the main road here. If it was a pauper grave, you would have been farther away, so you would have been back there towards the edges and everything, where you see a lot of the open grave sites that have collapsed over time, because back in the days of the 1870s, 1860s, it was very common to bury people 8 deep, especially if it was a pauper's grave. So that's what they did around here. That's why we unfortunately have a lot of the collapsing graves and everything, and no record of actually who's there, because they couldn't afford headstones and everything. So that's why we're trying to look for some paper records, either through the current NHS record system or with private collectors and everything. So yeah, that's what we're trying to do.
So we know that Aaron Kosminski was taken
Yes.
by his brother Wolf to Eastham Cemetery. Where we're standing here, you're telling me that this is the staff graveyard, but also the inmates, or say patients, or even residents, or even service users' graveyard. We can see here a wooden headstone.
Right. So this would be Eliza Weeks. She's one of the noted ones. Now, this is a wooden headstone that we had. Now, Eliza worked for the hospital over 30 years. She passed away in 1917 at the age of 62. So she would have had an honored place here for having so much service with the hospital, as everybody did. So this is just an example of how they used to take care of everybody if you did long service. You got the gold watch, and a free place to be buried. So.
Thank you. Now, also, as I've noticed, we've walked around, we can see that certain pockets or dates are all around the same time. So if Aaron Kosminski wasn't taken from, his body wasn't taken from Leavesden Asylum by his brother Wolf, he may have been buried in this section, you say?
That's right. If Aaron Kosminski was actually left here and he had not been taken away, because of the way they would have organized everybody in the same times, passing away in the same years or close to or whatever, it's a good likelihood that Aaron Kosminski would have been buried right over in the northwest corner over there in the pauper section.
In the pauper section. So the one thing I'd like to ask you is about the cholera epidemic.
Right.
And could you explain to me about where they buried the bodies there?
Right. What happened was we had a rumor, there was a history, a story being told of a mass grave somewhere. And as I started doing some research about 2 years ago, I was in the archives up in Hertfordshire County. And the first cemetery that we had was actually across the street from this one. And that was the first one they had in 1870. Then only about 16 years later, they requested an additional 1,192 square yards of cemetery space from the farm. Well, that's kind of odd, because you wouldn't have filled up a cemetery in 17 years just with the normal rate, especially if they were burying everybody 8 deep. You would have had a lot of room for many years. So what we found out during the records was also during that time they requested money for the investigation of the water system. They also wanted to investigate a fever outbreak. Now, if you put that all together, they requested more space. They didn't really fill the space that they had in the first instance when they first opened the hospital. They were investigating the water, and they were investigating a fever outbreak. Then all of a sudden, they have 6 years later, they move all the way from that, and now they're across the where we are here in 1905 in the new cemetery. So if you put that all together, that's a pretty good explanation for where the mass grave might be. We don't know how many people are there, we don't know how many people really died, but it is the one area in all of the park, in all of this site now, that is restricted as far as access to. No one's allowed to go in there, you're not allowed to develop it, you're not allowed to sell it, you can't do anything with that land. So there's restrictions on the land. The time frame just shows that something happened and they had to move away from that quite quick. So I think that pretty much solves the mystery of where the mass grave is.
Listen, Martin, thank you ever so much
pleasure.
for your time. Thank you.
Thanks.